Empowering leaders to drive meaningful change from within. Abstract. This article outlines an approach for empowering organizational leaders to drive meaningful and sustainable cultural change from within. It begins by emphasizing the importance of cultivating intrinsic motivation over extrinsic compliance through satisfying psychological needs and appealing to higher goals and purposes. For key enabling conditions are also identified that provide leaders optimal environments for change initiatives, systems thinking perspective, psychological safety, distributed leadership models, and dynamic supports. With motivation and framework conditions optimized, leaders can directly apply techniques proven to influence behaviors, such as feedback, collaborative goal setting, and identity reframing. Examples from healthcare and manufacturing illustrate application in different industry contexts. The approach promotes grassroots initiatives over top-down mandates and emphasizes small, continuous shifts compounding over time rather than radical overhauls. By developing intrinsic commitment and capacity in internal leaders, the brief argues organizations can spark true cultural transformation from their most potent resource, leadership empowered to change from within. For organizations seeking transformational change, the greatest resource lies not in external initiatives or top-down directives, but in empowering existing leaders from within. When a company's internal leaders feel intrinsically motivated and equipped to drive positive change in their teams, lasting cultural shifts can take root. However, enabling meaningful behavior change requires recognizing both human nature and systems thinking. Leaders must understand what drives individual and group behaviors while also grasping how to positively influence underlying organizational structures. Policies and Incentives, Senge, 1990. With the right support and framework conditions, leaders can become change agents capable of transforming culture from the inside out. Today we will explore an approach for empowering leaders to drive meaningful, sustainable change within their organizations. Through a review of relevant literature across disciplines such as psychology, management, and systems thinking, key principles will be identified for cultivating intrinsic motivation and fostering empowering framework conditions. Cultivating intrinsic motivation. A core belief underlying this brief is that the most meaningful and sustainable change emanates from intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivations. Ryan and Deci. 2000. Individuals are inherently more committed to goals they personally subscribe to rather than those forced upon them externally. Similarly, cultural shifts become far more ingrained when driven by leaders who feel ownership over the needed changes as opposed to mere compliance with top-down mandates. With this in mind, the first step is cultivating leaders' intrinsic desire to enact positive change. Recognizing psychological needs. All human beings possess fundamental psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Deci and Ryan, 1985. Effective leaders understand this and work to satisfy these needs for themselves and their teams. They avoid micromanaging and controlling behaviors that undermine autonomy, instead providing choice and fostering self-directed learning that enhances competence. Leaders also build relatedness through developing trust-based relationships and a sense of community. Satisfying these core psychological needs is key to enabling intrinsic motivation. Appealing to higher goals, rather than emphasizing only surface-level compliance. Leaders should appeal to deeper intrinsic values like serving customers, healthier communities, or making a positive social impact. Research shows individuals are more motivated by purpose and meaning than by external pressures or incentives. Pink. 2009. By framing needed changes around higher goals that people already intrinsically care about, buy-in and ownership multiply. Facilitating self-determination. Instead of mandating top-down solutions, successful leaders facilitate an open dialogue where teams determine changes themselves. Hefetz et al. 2009. This satisfies needs for autonomy and builds internal commitment. Leaders pose questions and provide coaching consultation, but power remains with employees. Teams also experience greater competence as their self-determined solutions increase chances of success. Overall, this fosters intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation for change. Developing mastery and purpose. Leaders should look for ways to provide ongoing learning, skill building and opportunities for progressing to higher levels of responsibility. Pink. 2009. This satisfies the human drive for competence and achieving flow states through mastery. Leaders also help employees derive greater purpose from their roles by clarifying connections between individual tasks and organizational goals. Together, these satisfy fundamental needs and cultivate intrinsic reasons to embrace change. Cultivating the right enabling conditions while intrinsic motivation is key. Even the most driven leaders require optimal framework conditions to effectively spark and sustain change initiatives. Senge. 1990. With this in mind, organizations must thoughtfully cultivate environments that empower rather than constrain their leaders. For enabling conditions are particularly important. Systems thinking perspective. Leaders need to understand their organizations as complex, interdependent systems instead of simple cause-effect machines. They must recognize unintended consequences of interventions and how one change in the system can impact another. With systems thinking, leaders avoid simplistic solutions and consider innovative options for leveraging feedback loops. Senge. 1990. Psychological safety. For change initiatives to succeed, leaders require safe environments allowing for risks, mistakes, and dissenting views. Edmondson, 1999. Challenging existing behavior patterns poses risks. So leaders need psychological safety to experiment with new approaches without fear of blame or retribution. Leaders cultivate psychological safety by being approachable, validating viewpoints, and focusing on learning from failures. Distributed leadership. Rather than a top-down model, distributed leadership empowers individuals throughout organizations to drive change. Harris. 2013. Leaders share responsibility and decision-making broadly based on strengths and situational needs. They develop other leaders and relinquish control themselves when others are better poised to lead. This generates shared ownership over transformations instead of singular points of failure. Dynamic supports. Leaders face ongoing challenges requiring dynamic support systems. Communities of practice connect leaders tackling similar issues. Wenger et al. 2002. Mentoring and coaching enhance specific skills. Training provides new frameworks and techniques. Accessible performance data, best practices from success stories, and constructive feedback also enable ongoing improvements to change initiatives. With intrinsic motivation and these enabling conditions cultivated, leaders gain the ability and support structures needed to truly spark meaningful transformations from within their organizations. The remainder of this brief outlines practical techniques they can apply when empowered in this way. Applying motivational techniques to drive change with motivation and conducive environments in place. Leaders can directly apply proven methods for influencing individual and group behaviors to ignite cultural transformations. Multiple techniques exist, but three particularly impactful approaches include using feedback, setting goals collaboratively, and reframing identity. Feedback. Establishing ongoing performance feedback systems allows leaders and teams to measure progress, learn from mistakes, and course-correct initiatives. Kluger and Denisai. 1996. However, feedback impacts motivation only when approached properly. Leaders carefully avoid judgment or criticism, instead focusing on constructive development. Feedback also concentrates on modifiable behaviors rather than fixed traits. When developed collaboratively between leaders and teams, feedback loops sustain intrinsic drive for continuous improvement. Collaborative goal setting. Goals powerfully direct individual and group efforts when formulated through participative, team-based processes. Locke and Latham, 2002. Leaders avoid setting unilateral goals, instead facilitating discussions where teams determine ambitious yet attainable targets they feel ownership over. By breaking higher goals into milestones, teams experience ongoing achievement and flow states driving efforts. Leaders also foster communities celebrating wins to maintain enthusiasm. Goal setting, done right, becomes an intrinsically motivating change technique. Identity reframing. Individual and group identities influence behaviors by shaping intrinsic aspirations. Iborra, 1999. Leaders recognize this and help reframe how employees view themselves, their work, and their organization. Storytelling highlights noble aspects of existing identities aligning with needed changes. Leaders also elevate roles by emphasizing exciting aspects of new possible identities, like innovators, that employees intrinsically want to claim. Reframing triggers inner drives to act in identity-congruent ways central to enacting transformations. To conclude, these three techniques, feedback, collaborative goal setting, and identity reframing, represent high-impact methods available to any leader when motivation and environments are optimized. Their practical application depends on industry and organization-specific contexts. As the next section demonstrates, driving change through empowered leaders, case examples to demonstrate how empowered leaders can spark meaningful change in practical contexts. Two examples provide illustrations of the techniques in action. The first involves a regional hospital seeking to improve patient outcomes and experiences through cultural shifts toward collaborative care teams. Leaders lack controls to directly mandate changes but can enable frontline empowerment. They establish systems for measuring competency-based feedback between caregivers to surface developmental areas. Teams then determine shared targets, such as reduced readmission rates, ownership over which fuels efforts. Leaders also highlight how collaborative identities produce better results by reframing roles and storytelling care examples. Outcomes include enhanced teamwork and consistent year-over-year gains in multiple quality metrics. A second scenario involves a manufacturing firm transitioning to serve broader markets through expanded product ranges requiring flexible production systems. Leaders cannot impose top-down restructuring but can cultivate change readiness. They form cross-functional problem-solving communities supported by mentoring programs. Discussions focus on customer and market needs, while production associates determine improved workflow designs leveraging strengths. Leaders celebrate milestone completions and tell stories emphasizing innovative identities. Outcomes consist of employee-driven process overhauls and multiple successful new product launches ahead of schedule. In both cases, leaders satisfy needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness among frontline employees and teams. They establish enabling conditions allowing grassroots change initiatives rather than forcing directives. Motivational techniques then help embed transformation as an intrinsically driven, continuous cultural journey versus a one-off mandate. Outcomes materialize through empowered teams driving bottom-up shifts aligned with overall organizational aspirations. Conclusion for organizations seeking meaningful, sustainable change. The most potent catalyst often lies within, in the form of empowered, intrinsically motivated internal leaders. While external directives have limited impact, cultivating leaders' drive to transform from the inside out can spark real cultural evolution. This brief outlined an approach for organizations seeking to ignite such transformation. By developing intrinsic motivation through satisfying psychological needs and appealing to higher purposes, leaders gain inner drives for positive change. Complementary framework conditions supply the support needed, including systems thinking, psychological safety, distributed leadership models, and dynamic supports. Empowered in this way, leaders can directly apply techniques proven to influence behaviors through feedback, collaborative goal setting, and identity reframing. Overall, the approach emphasizes enabling grassroots initiatives versus top-down mandates. It recognizes human motivation as an opportunity rather than constraint and the power of small shifts compounding over time versus radical overhauls. When organizations cultivate the intrinsic commitment and capacity of their internal leaders, sustainable cultural transformation becomes possible. The greatest resource for transformative change indeed lies within.